headline. I always let the source define itself, and that's appropriate in this case. The technocracy was a movement started back in the 1930s originally. It was in the heat of the Great Depression. It happened at Columbia University in particular. Scientists and engineers got together to address the problem of the Depression. It was really pretty depressing time. The soup lines, unemployment, financial disasters, and so on. And it really looked like capitalism as free enterprise was going to die. So these engineers, egotistical as they were, said, we can do better. We can invent a new economic system from scratch that will solve all the problems of the world, essentially, and will really just kind of take us into the future. And they call this system technocracy. It was to be a resource-based economic system, not based on pricing mechanisms like we understand supply and demand, but rather based on energy. And they actually proposed to use an energy script instead of money, and let energy be the determining factor on what was produced, bought, and sold, and consumed, and so on. But being engineers and scientists, in 1938, when this definition came out, which I'm going to read, they had kind of capsulized what they viewed as the scientific method and the scientific approach. And it's important to see that today, because we see the same subtleties, the same mindsets, the same thinking processes that they had back then. And I will contend it's a very dangerous thing. It's a dangerous thinking process. But here's what they concluded in 1938 themselves. They said, technocracy is the science of social engineering, the scientific operation of the entire social mechanism to produce and distribute goods and services to the entire population. And first off, you'll see that it's the science of social engineering. That ought to be enough to make the hair stand up on the back of your head, because who wants to be scientifically engineered by somebody that you don't know, somebody that doesn't know you, but rather has this idea that they can reform you, remake you in some other image. But most importantly, you see the economic aspect that they had in mind, the scientific operation of the entire social mechanism. That's all the people in society, to produce and distribute goods and services to the entire population. This was an economic system from the get-go, not a political system.
There are goals too that you mentioned is sustainable development.
Yes.
That is ostensibly a good thing and beneficial thing. But why don't you help us understand why ultimately it's not?
Well, that's right. The United Nations has declared that sustainable development is going to be the new economic system of the future. It's a resource-based economic system. It's based on energy. You see the talk about cap and trade and carbon and stuff all over the place. And a couple of years ago, the head of climate change at the UN, Christiana Figueres, gave a press conference in Europe, and she said, this is the first time in the history of mankind that we're setting ourselves the task of intentionally, within a defined period of time, to change the economic development model that has been reigning for at least 150 years since the Industrial Revolution. That's a direct quote from her lips. I dedicated a chapter in my book to demonstrate that sustainable development is technocracy from the 1930s. It has all the same markers. It has all the same elements in it. It was brought to the United Nations by members of the Trilateral Commission, by the way, in the first place. And the entire doctrine of sustainable development and the other terms around it, you see, if people don't understand that, maybe green economy would be one, maybe Green New Deal would be something people would kind of identify with. Sustainable development is the United Nations, and they were the contagion that took it to the world. This is their vision for the future of society. is this sustainable future where they will control all the resources and all the consumption. In other words, they will tell businesses what they're allowed to build, and they will tell consumers what they're allowed to consume. Period. In a subject. You don't need to be involved in this. They figure this all out for you in advance. This is the science of social engineering here. They have the science. You just have to follow and do what they tell you to do. And it's very insidious. Of course, they have nice platitudes like we're going to eliminate poverty, we're going to have education for all, we're going to have jobs with dignity, and that's all wonderful stuff. But when you get down to the bottom of their so-called sustainable development goals, you see this whole thing of, well, all you have to do to get those things is just let us have all the control over the resources and the management of those resources on a global basis. Mm-hmm. The subtitle there, The Hard Road to World Order, was actually the title of an article written in 1974. It appeared in Foreign Affairs magazine. Most people don't know this, but if you went back and looked at it, you'd find that article. It was written by Richard Gardner. He was an academic at the time. Gardner was also one of the original members of the Trilateral Commission. So he was one of their academic members, right, that wrote the papers, kind of like the global warming and the big pharma people do. They get the studies paid for, and they can make them say whatever. Well, Gardner was one of those academics back then that supported the Trilateral Commission. And here's what he wrote in that essay that appeared, and that I kind of modeled my book after. I figured he deserved a response. This is what he wrote. He said, in short, the House of World Order would have to be built from the bottom up rather than from the top down. It will look like a great booming, buzzing confusion, to use William James' famous description of reality, but an end run around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece, will accomplish much more than the old-fashioned frontal assault. That's a quote. This is packed with stuff. Number one, he talks about the old-fashioned frontal assault, which is kind of what you're alluding to here. Well, in the past before that, there had been many so-called frontal assaults to change the system. They'd all failed. Mm-hmm. They didn't get anywhere. They just tried brute force to do it, and they didn't get anywhere. And national sovereignty was the big stumbling block, basically, because Americans held on to the Constitution. So they talk about an end run around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece. Well, isn't that exactly what's happened over the last 45 years? It took them a long time, but they're just about complete with that. And most importantly, it says that building the world order from the top down, which didn't work, the frontal assault, it needed to be built from the bottom up. In other words, from the local grassroots level up. That's exactly what sustainable development has done now on a global basis. They have gone to every local community and seeded those sustainable development ideas into those communities so that they can build the system from the bottom up. That's part of their infrastructure also. It is a tough one, and it's not always an easy answer, but I believe very strongly that local activism at this point is the only way to rebuild our country, if there is going to be any rebuilding at all. Local activism. This is how they got us, was building it from the bottom up. Agenda 21 is the keystone document for sustainable development. It was developed in 1992 at the Rio de Janeiro conference of the United Nations, the so-called, it was the first Earth Summit, as well as, I forget, they call it the IUCN or something, but it was a big United Nations meeting. And this became the agenda for the 21st century. And the doctrine that came to be known as Agenda 21 came from a book that was written just a few years earlier by Gru Harlem Brundtland. She chaired the Brundtland Commission for the United Nations, and she produced a book called Our Common Future. And that book was singularly the book that fueled all the doctrines that went into Agenda 21. United Nations consider her to be the mother of Agenda 21. It just incidentally, Gru Harlem Brundtland was a member. She chaired the committee and she wrote the book, edited and wrote most of it. She was a member of the Trilateral Commission. So we know where this doctrine came from. We know where it came from. It's unmistakable. And this was trilateral policy to feed this Agenda 21 and sustainable development into the United Nations so it would become contagion to take it to the whole planet. And they have done a very good job of that.